Hello, and welcome to Why It Matters Integration Unraveled, a Blueprint 1543 podcast. I'm Rebecca Dorsey, co founder and vice president of Blueprint 1543. At Blueprint, our mission is to support integrated people, integrated churches, and integrated inquiry to help people ask and answer some of life's biggest questions using the tools of the sciences and the Christian faith. The goal of this podcast is to ask, why does integration matter in each of these areas, in everyday sciencey people's lives, in churches, and in inquiry? Today, I'm joined by long-term colleague John Van Sloten, who is potentially an integrated person who is creating integrated churches. I say potentially because we're going to dig in and actually ask John directly and see what we think by the end. In this podcast, we're going to go behind the scenes of real people approaching work in interesting and potentially integrated ways. John, thanks so much for joining us on this recording today.
Hey, Rebecca, a pleasure, and thanks for having me.
Now, first things first, because I realize most of our interactions are usually over email, and then when we're in person, you don't say somebody's full last name very often. Did I actually pronounce your last name properly?
I didn't hear it as mispronounced, so it is John Van Sloten. So I think you nailed it.
Okay, fantastic. Well, John is a pastor, author, and all-around people person. And I think it's helpful to start by going back in time and thinking just about when and how we met and how we became colleagues working together in this space. Now, my recollection is that it was around 2015 in the STEAM project was the acronym, which stood for Science and Theology for Emerging Adult Ministries. But within that process, John, do you remember when and how did you and I actually meet?
Yeah, probably with one of the site visits, one of the two meetings that we had. The connection to STEAM happened for me. It was right in the middle of my John Templeton Foundation funded addiction problem, where I was moving from one program at Regent College to scientists and congregations. And I think it was probably Greg Kutsona or Drew over at Science for the Church who let me know about this one. And they were, of course, involved with it. So yeah, I think I showed up there, or probably emails from you, right? Because you were really running the show for that thing and made contact. So I missed the one Catalina Island thing, which I will regret for the rest of my life.
And you should. It was a fantastic,
It was.
fantastic event. Yeah.
Yeah, I could have got to know everybody a little bit more. But yeah, no, these grants, and that grant in particular, and working with you and everybody, has been a part of a larger journey for me. I've been on Science for Seminaries grants and other things since, where for about 10 or 12 years, I've been exploring the intersection of faith and science in the context of preaching. And yeah, it's been a great opportunity to sort of make the space within my vocational place to explore that conversation. It's been transformative for me. So thanks for your part in that.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to digging into some of those transformative parts and just learning more about what it's looked like to be an integrated person and looking to create these integrated churches and digging into why some of that matters. Just as far as getting started, what pulled you into, you said you had a string of John Templeton Foundation grants around this science integration with faith. What pulled you into that in general interest to start out?
The first grant through Regent College, which in their invitation letter said, "We believe that God speaks through two books, the Bible and creation." And the moment I read that and then read the invitation to come and look at looking through the world through the lens of science within that two book worldview, I was hooked. I had been writing books and preaching sermons about God in pop culture, God in art, God in vocation. At that time, I was just finishing a book on God and work and all kinds of people's jobs and how their image bearing reflects the nature of their maker. And then this science thing shows up, and I'd gotten a lot of heat, preaching and writing about Metallica and other things that weren't straight from the Bible. But science is talking about, explores creation, and there isn't a Christian church, that wouldn't see creation as something God had a lot to do with, and something that might in fact be reflective of God's wisdom. So it was kind of a natural, science should have started with that one, and got people accepting creational revelation as a valid thing. But it showed up when it did, and at a time when I had several scientists who knew in our little church plant, and it all sort of came together. So it was my background, Reformed theology, is huge on creation as a source of revelation. The New Testament's clear. Everything in creation was made in, through, and for Christ. You could cite passage after passage affirming that he's the wisdom through which everything is. And if it's true, and I want to know him more in all things, then I'd like to read everything he's written. So the scriptures are obviously a huge thing, but then wearing the scriptures like a pair of glasses, as Calvin says, engaging God's wisdom in creation, just seemed like a no-brainer.
Well, I am excited to dig into some of that with you and hear some more specifics and details, and move from the big ideas down into practical examples and stories, and kind of bring this to life a little bit. Now, what prompted me to reach out to you for this particular podcast was reading the newsletter article that you did recently for the Science for the Church newsletter. And in that newsletter, I admit I actually did laugh out loud sitting in a room by myself when I read you referred to, and I quote you here, the people group called scientists. And I thought that was so beautiful, having been professionally partnered with many of these people group called scientist types over my career. And there are some nuances there. Each discipline and profession, I guess, has some nuances to it. And it just made me laugh when I read that. And I thought, this is going to be a really good person to just dig into some of this integration and integrated churches with. So one thing that we're often asked when we talk about integration is, why does that matter? Why can't people just operate in parallel? We have so many different parts of our identity and so many different parts of what we do in life. Why do we need to be living and operating with integration between our faith perspective and the work that we do? In particular, for those who are working in the sciences. But why does it matter to integrate those things instead of operate in parallel? Right. And in particular, when we start looking at churches and this idea of what would it look like to be an integrated church, then it starts to get even bigger and murkier. And what does that even look like? And why would that matter? There are so many different types of people that go to church and that, kind of make up the pews, as you might say. So I'm curious, as you have worked with this people group called scientists, what made you start thinking the sciences and preaching, the sciences and church life? I want to bring those together somehow. What sparked that for you?
Yeah. Well, building on what I just said, that science unpacks and engages and reads a text, what I believe to be a text that is creation, and that I want to know God more. As a pastor, I think I'm obligated for a gathering of people who want to know God more, who I believe theologically are made to engage God everywhere, reading both of these books all the time, and those books, Revelation and each of the books co-illuminating the other and talking to each other, and ending up with a life that is surrounded by creational parables and reminders of God's presence in your life. I felt very obligated. It was a no-brainer to find a way to bring that to the church. And as a person who's impassioned for preaching and not good at Wednesday night studies, more inclined to think the most important place is Sunday morning in that slot. I thought, why not bring the connection of those two books to that slot? And so, yeah, that's where the grants gave me opportunity, because I was doing my faith and science coming together in the context of preaching. And those grants would enable me to reach out to scientists with the imprimatur of the John Templeton Foundation sometimes, because you looked more serious, and say, hey, I'm going to preach a sermon on what you do, scientist at the University of Calgary or other universities across North America. And they all said yes, to a person, mostly. I think one or two didn't. Said yes to the process. So yeah, I'm bringing science and faith together in the context of preaching in a sermon on a Sunday morning in a church, hoping that through the reading of those two texts side by side, people will have aha moments, come to Jesus moments, like oh my word moments, where the same Spirit who touches people's lives and opens their eyes to our faith and to Jesus, does that for the Jesus through whom the universe was mediated, and sort of the lordship of Christ over not just things in the Bible, not just even my life, but over all creation, kind of wows people and wraps around their lives, and again gives them a life filled with parables. And yeah, it's kind of just how I see the world now. We're having a water crisis in Calgary, and immediately I'm running through all that I learned about the hydrological system and the river and how water works in the watershed in southern Alberta, where I live. And I just immediately start thinking with scientific eyes and ears and curiosity about the nature of nature in a revelatory kind of way. What are you saying here, God, through this thing you made? Abraham Kuyper said that everything that is was the thought in the mind of God before it ever came to be. And that just resonates in me. And I'm always, what are you thinking? What are you thinking in terms of how that grass is growing, or those weeds, or trees and branches, and how they co-inhere? What was your wisdom in making them work that way?
Yeah. Well, let's go back a few steps, because you mentioned that you love preaching, and you even separated that out from other forms of ministry, like the Wednesday night service was your example there. What initially drew you towards preaching and towards ministry?
Like just science in particular, or the preaching and ministry in general for me?
Just preaching and ministry
Yeah.
in general. What drew you there? We've talked a little bit about what drew you towards using the sciences, but what
Yeah.
drew you into the ministry?
I had a come to Jesus moment in a parking lot, making a confession to a pastor, which started things for me. I was a real estate developer at the time, so I built office buildings and shopping centers. And then 3 months after that, a son with Down syndrome was born, our third child, and that devastated me. I was undone. And through a much too long story to share now, a series of providences played out several months afterwards, which were so compelling to me and got me thinking, okay, the night he was born, and I was so devastated running those scenarios, you knew, God, that all of this was going to happen. It was so overwhelming that I kind of made the commitment to professionally want to work for God. If providence is true to this extent, and you hold the universe to this extent, and I didn't know any of this. I mean, I guess I grew up with it, but I didn't know theologically this was all, of course, true, but I was experiencing the heldness of everything. I thought, I want to work for you. And so I went to seminary and thought I would just be a regular pastor in a regular church. And I was doing stuff where you're trying to be relevant and use stuff from the culture. But there was a tipping point, a moment where I was using for relevance, became actually in my imagination and in reality a source of revelation. So moving from relevance to revelation, and then sort of applying this idea that truth, wherever we find it, is God's truth. And different language, different colors, different ways of communicating. It's different than the written word in the Bible. And the Bible I hold very highly. But yeah, if that's true, that you speak through creation, God, then I'll dedicate my life to it. And as I said, I have a preaching bias. Churches sometimes do faith and science stuff in the back corners midweek, and for those who would already be interested. I'm going, well, this is not an option. If God is speaking through supernovae 40 times a second in our known universe, we ought to all be listening. And so in where churches do their most important things, I thought this most important idea, those two things needed to come together.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. That is actually a piece I didn't know about, a career transition there and coming into ministry following some of those pivotal life moments. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
When you think about then getting into your preaching space, you said in your newsletter, I believe, that you had a handful of scientists that are in your church and that you had a relationship with them, and in talking with them, that prompted ideas, that prompted things to share about from the pulpit. And then you also shared a minute ago about interviewing some, kind of quote, serious scientists through some of the grant work that you were doing. What kinds of questions did you ask the scientists that were in your actual congregation?
Yeah. Well, it always started with bumping into them and meeting them, right? And so tonight, my wife and I are going out for dinner with a nephrologist and his wife, and he showed up at our church 15 years ago and said he was a kidney doctor. And the moment he said it, I said, yeah, what are kidneys about? What's the kidneyness of kidneys, right? And he started to talk about it. And I said, could I preach a sermon on that? Would you help me with that? Right? Because I am not trained in the sciences. I don't have an undergrad degree. I'm very intuitive and gut driven and relational and not empirical, but certainly I don't naturally lean that way. Ergo, the people group that are scientists, they would probably say it exactly the same back to pastors.
Right. The people that are pastor. Yep.
Yeah, right. But so met him, got to know him, and he said yes, right? So then we set up a meeting, usually a small group. So if we had two nephrologists, I would have invited the second as well. But a couple of science-connected people, and it was a couple of theologians at the time, and we sat in my office, and I developed a couple of questions, just very general questions at first. And the word love usually doesn't get accepted by the primarily empirically minded as the first word that you think of when you do your science. But everyone that I've interviewed, they always love what they do. I said, what do you love about the kidney, right? And so he just starts riffing about the kidney and nephrons. And if you link them all together, it could run to the moon and back, and this amazing filtering system for our blood, our urine, and how it works. And it works in a way that's opposite to how I thought it might work, like an oil filter. It does it the other way. It captures the good stuff and puts it back into your body and lets the bad stuff flow through. Anyway, we started to have a conversation. We backed and forth on it. I learned a whole bunch of new science words. He taught me how to pronounce some of those words. I would listen to him talk, and often him talk to the other science person, and I would have connections come to mind. Oh, that's like this from the scriptures, or that from what Jesus said, or that from the prophets. And I would just take notes. And then I'd go away and I'd sit down for 2 days and try to pull it together and put the two books side by side. And often it was literally side by side. The scientist would say X. I would put Jesus saying Y right beside it, and just let those two things be juxtaposed in the ears and the eyes of the hearer and seer on Sunday morning. But I'd write the sermon, and then I'd send it back to them to have it vetted, because it's science, right? It's peer-reviewed sermons. And I
love that, peer-reviewed sermons.
Yeah, right. Well, it has to be. Really I don't know what I'm doing. I do not, I need their help, a scientist's help in the research. I need it in the writing. I need it in the vetting. I need it in the post-delivery. How did that go? I've needed it in the delivery. So the kidney doctor got up and did a sort of kidney 101, just the science of it. He wasn't really doing a lot of preaching. He just introduced everybody to what the organ that he dedicated his life to. And then I went and did the whole 2-book thing afterwards. And people sat there. And yeah, we don't do polls during the service or afterwards. But after an accumulation of these science sermons, and they were always sermons not on the conflict areas, right? That always is a place where churches go, origins or at more highly moral, ethical conflict, like who has a problem with the kidney, right? Or the biomechanics of the human knee, or stress reducing mechanisms in your brain, or DNA repair mechanisms, or the nature of the eye, on and on and on. Preached a lot of the human body. But as more and more of that happened, it became more normal for the people, and I think they were starting to get it. Okay, this isn't just a novelty. This isn't just a science class. It's not a lecture. It's still a sermon, but it's this amalgamation of it all.
Now, what did you learn just going through that process of having conversations with a nephrologist, for example? What did you learn about preaching that was powerful about bringing people together around the sciences?
What I alluded to, that it may take a while for people to be where you're at in terms of what you think is happening. But arguably that could be any preacher in any pulpit anywhere, just preaching the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a thing. Like I'd never heard a sermon about the nature of tree branches ever in my life. So I would often, before we got up, I would think, okay, this is the first time this is probably happening in the world as a text, right? People use things as illustrations all the time, but as an actual text with the Bible. So it takes a while. And you can't do it too much. I've learned when we were sort of right in the thick of all these grants and preaching 6 times a year, maybe, because people would come about, that hurt my brain. I'm going, great. I love causing brain injuries in that way. Like, it's good to think about these things, but it's also, it can be pretty abstract at times, right? Like you're talking about the science of the biology of how a branch works, and branches work in infinitely a number of different ways around the world, depending on the environment, on everything that's, and that's a very sciencey thing. And then you're putting it alongside, I am the vine and you are the branches, which talks about remain in me. And you're trying to layer the branch trunk connection over top of the words of Jesus, which I always imagine he was saying it in a vineyard to his disciples sitting there so they'd remember. So talk about a God's imprimatur, maybe, to preach these kinds of sermons. But it's abstract. It's there's a lot going on, right? It's not a simple 3-point, now go and do this kind of thing.
Right.
So that's been a lesson. I don't think we've run into too much conflict with people. I mean, once I did. Once I just sort of assumed everybody in the audience was knew the universe was 13.8 billion years old, we think, and just sort of was talking with a tone that kind of was dismissive of anything other than that, and really offended somebody who ended up leaving the church as a result of the being dissed that way. So I could have been more careful. And to me, looking back, that was evidence that, yeah, those areas are always very touchy for people, and they've had experiences and they bring that to a Sunday morning. So again, non-confrontational physical texts and environmental texts without any agenda, just what do these things reveal about, have been the safest. Not that you want to be safe all the time, but in the most effective way of getting people to trust the language of science and the abstraction with which you're bringing what it looks at, to what the Bible teaches.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing some of those specific examples. I'm always such a bring it to life, give me some examples kind of a person. That helps me a lot. So you mentioned looking at the biology of the vine and the tree branches and what's actually happening in the real physical world with trees and branches, and layering that over that scripture verse around I'm the vine, you are the branches. And so, can you think of any other specific examples of what did this look like? We've had kidneys and nephrologists, we've had branches. Can you think of another one or two examples that you used in some of these sermons, bringing the sciences together with theology?
Yeah. After preaching a sermon on epigenetics with a researcher from our church, we were out for dinner on grant monies, and he says to his wife, "Tell Pastor John what just happened for you." And she was a neuroscientist, and so she shared that she had just uncovered what others had postulated for decades, but she got to see for the first time a neural stress reducing mechanism in the brain, kind of 5-stage process where the brain naturally releases an opioid-like substance to lower stress levels when things are freaking out and our neurons are overfiring. And in her words, the noise is too loud. She found this mechanism that kind of turns the volume down on neural activity and quiets us. And so as she was describing it at that dinner, the verse that's running through my mind is this far and no more, that God allows evil and difficulty and struggle to go this far and no more. The water rose up to my neck, but I didn't go under, right? Like this one intersection, or place that we've all been, where we think we're going to go under, but we don't, right? And that God is the kind of God who keeps that from happening. And so that was happening biologically in our brains with no agency or free will on our part at all. Nobody made a choice to turn the volume down. It just happens biologically. An amazing grace has happened. How many times in your life, in my life, and kept us from totally. Yeah, it begs the question, what about for those who do go total? Okay, but for most of us, most of the time, there's this common grace biological parable. And she saw it. And so, yeah, the process played out, asked a whole bunch of questions, wrote the sermon, preached it. It ended up going online, getting all kinds of attention. It ended up going online the same week that her discovery was being published in Nature and Neuroscience. And it became a bit of a problem because she said, can you just turn the volume down on the church thing because it's getting all the attention, and the Nature Neuroscience thing is the most important thing for my career right now. And right. but I just, that they were happening together to me was perfect. We should, when we discover something of the wisdom of God embedded in our brains that helps us all in this way, be praising God on Sunday morning for it, and in our churches, even as we're praising it in, esteemed scientific journals. Those things should be happening at the same time, in my imagination. And, a lot of scientists who are not people of faith would go get lost. And a lot of churches, sometimes people, too much anti-science bias, would say get lost. But for a lot of people, that's, and for me, it's a very compelling thing that it could happen together.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's one of the, I wrote a book on faith and science called God Speaks Science, and I wrote a whole chapter on that whole neuroscience story. And yeah, it's happened 70 or 80 times. It just, I'm looking out my studio window here, and there's bugs on the rocks, and I met a scientist who taught me about diapause and how insects overwinter by basically shutting themselves down. And there were lessons in the overwintering saving work of diapause and insects that were instructive for our city as we were going through COVID and everybody was roiled. And how do we go through a winter like this? And they ended up coming together in a sermon and in an op-ed for the newspaper, which I get to be a columnist for. They allow a preacher to write and publish these kinds of stories because bugs are ubiquitous and the universe is a universal text, and kidneys, well, we think our audience all has kidneys. It's just, talk about integration. It's just being integrated. Bugs are now integrated into my walk with Jesus, where every time I think of them, I think of these lessons. I could go on. Our river, I preached on that and written on that, and got involved with a hydrologist at the University of Calgary on that. just parable after parable after parable.
So what kind of impact do you think bringing the sciences into church has had on the church itself? Other than hurting people's brains a little bit, you said.
Yeah. I mean, there were a lot of people. There were a lot of science-oriented, empirically oriented people who, up until that point in their life, where they heard a sermon on their thing or where they participated in the writing of the sermon. So you don't just have to be a deacon in the church. You don't just have to be part of a small group or give. We'd like you to give. But actually, no, lean into the exact gift mix God has given you with that data-driven, clearly focused, insatiable curiosity oriented being, and help create a sermon. Our church's one of the holy ways that we lift up our God and our hearts to God. Get involved that way. And these are some of these, I had a scientist a couple of years ago say to me in the sanctuary after church that, I'm so glad you're doing this. I've had to hide my science from my church all my life. Where were you when I was in university? He said, quote unquote. And so for him to be involved in doing that and honored, we do it for missionaries. We do it for teachers in some of our churches. Some more vocationally aware churches are doing it for other kinds of jobs. But we were doing it for scientists in that way. And I think it was transformative for the scientists. And more than that, like this idea of the co-illumination between the book of creation and the book of the Bible, that was new for many of the scientists. I'm a scientist, I do all of this, and I'm going to be a good, ethical, Christ-like person in my morals and ethics and behavior. And I'm going, no, be a Jesus-like person in terms of how you love pattern and can handle lots of data and process things and be empirically minded in that way as well. And so that's been, for some, a very transformative moment. And that's gratifying. And that's gratifying when it happens for anyone in your church. But for this people group that are scientists who've been, I think, ignored way too much and not been leaned into for what is arguably, if you believe creation is a book through which God speaks, what is arguably one of the greatest things we can do as a church. Science is the greatest ally I can imagine for the church in terms of engaging revelation and creation. When you go there with them, that changes everything and people's perspective on them. Yeah, what's nice with doing it with scientists in your church is that, hold on, this guy was sitting beside me last Sunday, and now I didn't even know he did that, and he knows what he's doing, and he's helping me know God more. Like I would have the next science, like it did with that dinner, right? The epigeneticist introduces me to the neuroscience. Like, this is good. And yeah, people want, the scientists I've met want to be a part of it and have been very thankful for the process.
Yeah, it sounds like a really beautiful way to bring the way that God created them, the way that God created their minds and their contributions, and to bring that into the church and to honor that and to display that wisdom and that intellect, and to be able to learn more then about the world that God created through the people that he created and the talents and skills that they have. So that is a beautiful kind of cycle. Then it sounds like you brought in. So that's some impact on the science people in your church. Does anything come to mind for the impact that it had maybe on people who don't have any kind of science training or background in the congregations that you were preaching in?
Yeah. I'm one of the probably greatest gifts to me personally, which hasn't been mentioned so far, has been how this is so good for humility when you're called to be the pastor who knows the Bible, who is the theologian in the of record, right? And the guy, to not know how to say apoptosis or pronounce a scientific word properly is a good thing for everyone to see. So they're seeing, the non-scientist is seeing a non-scientist pastor have conversations with these real scientists, and that it can be done, that there's something that can be learned, that it's not that complicated. Get over your grade 11, I'm finally done science thing. And you can still do that. You can still read. There's lots of good popular science out there. And okay, we're going to use it to know God. So maybe it's a trustworthy source more than I've been giving. So that kind of move starts to happen. So yeah, all of those things have I've seen and heard from people. And like I said earlier, the moment and this is not all on eloquence or theory. I mean, you're thinking that the Spirit of God is whispering to people. I was a part of that, right? That thing in the universe, that the way gravity works, why ice is slippery, etc., etc. God had something to do with that, and I think that then that can mess you up in the best sense. You can't walk down the street without, oh yeah, just pointers everywhere, like the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, right, where it's just on every wall there's another beautiful painting, and the collection of paintings, the sense of standing in the middle of a room filled with art and beauty and truth, that becomes your way of living in the world. So I don't know, the people who were at the church where this was all happening might go, yeah, I don't know, John, that didn't happen for me. But I think for some it did, and you can't go back then. God speaks through creation, and science helps me do that. You have to listen and read the news differently. You just take in your world with a whole new worldview.
Yeah, it sounds like you're describing an expanding of how someone might look at the world, and at the same time demonstrating a humility from the front of the room, from the voice that is literally being mic'd and amplified to everybody in the space, having that humility of, here are the things that I know something about, and here are the things that I'm learning from others about, and bringing others' wisdom and expertise up to the front of the room. That's just a beautiful demonstration right there as well, that no one person knows everything, and being able to have that humble spirit, even in teaching and training. I think that's a beautiful example. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as we look to kind of wrap up this conversation on what it means to be cultivating an integrated church, is there anything else that comes to mind that you want to be sure to share?
Yeah, I think we covered a lot of what has been the experience so far. I mean, maybe just to re-emphasize the sort of broader uptake of being a community or a theologian or a person of faith, integrating these two things, the potential for a broader uptake, like the secular newspaper, the Calgary Herald, is publishing pieces that are, and you write it a certain way, and as a faith leader, I think, so you're not preaching at anybody, but the topics are so universal and interesting to people. And then that has happened in the offices of a scientist who was an expert on runners' legs and ran a big, the world's first human performance lab that was started decades ago, happened here at Calgary in the kinesiology department. And he was a Jesuit, grew up, left the faith because there was no room for his science questions. And we had this beautiful kind of interaction. And he didn't come back to the faith as a result of the process, but that he was even willing to talk was beautiful. So my hope and my experience has been that talking about revelation out there in people's worlds is a beautiful way for God to let people know that God has got something to do with those worlds.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of those specific examples and helping to bring to life what an integrated church can look like and the power of involving the people that are in your congregation in their areas of expertise, whether that's in the sciences or in another area, being able to share that. So thank you so much, John, for being with us as we were exploring why it matters, Integration Unraveled, a podcast trying to figure out what it looks like in everyday life to be interesting and integrated. So thank you so much, John, and thanks everyone for listening.